The salt spray felt like a million tiny kisses against her skin, a final gentle caress from a world that was about to betray her. One moment, Catherine was gazing at the diamond-dusted surface of the Mediterranean, her husband Daniel's arm, a familiar, comforting weight around her shoulders. He whispered how their life together was as perfect and endless as the horizon. The next moment, that comforting weight became a brutal shove. The world tilted a chaotic blur of dark water and receding lights from the yacht. The last thing she saw was his face, not twisted in regret, but cold and impassive, standing beside his beautiful, smiling mistress, Victoria Sharp. The splash was a thunderclap, and the icy water a liquid tomb, stealing her breath and swallowing her screams. He left her for dead. He had no idea he had just created a ghost, and ghosts always come back to haunt. Catherine Walsh had never imagined a life of such opulence. A librarian from a quiet suburb of Boston, her world had been one of paper and ink, of quiet afternoons and modest dreams. Then Daniel Petrov walked into her library, a whirlwind of charisma and ambition. He was a tech mogul, a self-made man with a story that could charm anyone. A hungry immigrant who had built a billion-dollar empire. Petrov Innovations from nothing. He saw Catherine, he said, and saw an anchor, a quiet strength that his chaotic world desperately needed. Their courtship was a fairy tale. He didn't just buy her things. He curated experiences. A private tour of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, a surprise trip to see the northern lights from a glass igloo in Finland, a simple picnic on a deserted beach in California, where he finally proposed with a ring that held more value than her childhood home. She fell not for the money, but for the man she believed he was attentive, brilliant, and utterly devoted. After they married, the golden threads of their life began to weave into a gilded cage, so subtly she barely noticed. Her small circle of friends found Daniel charming, but intimidating. He would host lavish dinners, where he'd monopolize the conversation with talk of mergers and acquisitions, making her friends feel small and out of place. Slowly, they stopped calling. He surprised her by paying off her modest student loans and her parents' mortgage gestures that felt like love, but were in reality transactions that created a debt of gratitude. He encouraged her to leave her job at the library. "A woman like you, my brilliant Catherine," he'd say, kissing her forehead, "shouldn't be bound by a 9 to 5. Your job is to experience the world with me." She agreed, convincing herself it was a new, exciting chapter. But without her own work, her own friends, her own income, her world became Daniel. Her days were measured by his schedule. Her identity became Mrs. Petrov. Then came Victoria Sharp. Daniel introduced her as the new COO of his company's European division. Victoria was everything Catherine was not. She was a sleek predator in a world of bespoke suits and razor-sharp intellect. Her hair was a sheet of polished obsidian, her smile a weapon, and her eyes held a chillingly analytical gleam. Catherine, with her soft-spoken nature and love for classic literature, felt like a faded photograph next to Victoria's high-definition brilliance. "Victoria is a killer," Daniel would say with admiration after a business dinner. "She's exactly what we need to break into the Zurich market." Catherine tried to befriend her. She invited Victoria for lunch, but the conversation was stilted. Victoria seemed to look right through her, her gaze assessing, calculating, almost dismissive. She complimented Catherine's home with the detached air of an appraiser valuing an asset. A faint, cloying scent of jasmine seemed to follow Victoria everywhere. a scent Catherine soon started to smell on Daniel's clothes when he came home late from board meetings. The warning signs were there, small cracks in the perfect facade. A credit card statement with a charge for a suite at the Bauer au Lac in Zurich when Daniel was supposedly in Berlin. A hushed phone call that ended abruptly when she walked into the room. His growing impatience with her questions, which he dismissed as nagging. He'd deflect with grand gestures a new Cartier bracelet, a weekend in Monaco that left her feeling guilty for her suspicions. She was the librarian who'd won the prince. She told herself she was being ungrateful, paranoid. The final act of the charade was a trip to the Greek Isles on their private yacht, the Serenity. "Just the two of us, Kate," Daniel had promised, using his pet name for her. To reconnect, no phones, no business. But on the second day, as they docked in a secluded cove off the coast of Crete, a tender boat approached, and Victoria Sharp stepped aboard, dressed in a white bikini that seemed to mock Catherine's modest one-piece. Victoria was closing a deal nearby, Daniel explained with a seamless smile. "I thought what a wonderful surprise we can all celebrate together." The air on the yacht shifted. The crew became tense. Catherine felt like a third wheel on her own anniversary trip. She watched Daniel and Victoria, their heads bent close together, speaking in low murmurs, their body language a symphony of shared secrets. They would share a private joke and laugh, then look at Catherine as if suddenly remembering she was there. That evening, the sun bled across the sky in hues of orange and purple. The crew had been dismissed to their quarters. It was just the three of them on the sprawling deck. Daniel poured 3 glasses of champagne. He handed one to Catherine, his smile radiating a warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "To us," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "To a future brighter than we can ever imagine." He and Victoria shared a look, a flicker of something triumphant and dark. Catherine, wanting to believe to salvage the moment, raised her glass. She walked to the railing to look at the sunset, trying to recapture the magic of their early days. Daniel followed her. Victoria stayed by the lounge chairs, watching. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Catherine murmured, her back to him. "Breathtaking," Daniel said, his voice right behind her ear. He wrapped his arm around her shoulder. For a heartbeat, it felt safe, familiar. He leaned in and whispered, "I'm sorry, Kate. It's just business." Then came the shove. It wasn't frantic or angry. It was a single, calculated act of force. Her feet left the deck. The sky and sea swapped places. Her champagne flute shattered, and the world dissolved into a terrifying, cold darkness. The last sound she heard wasn't her own scream, but the faint, triumphant laughter of Victoria Sharp dancing on the wind. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, a brutal fist that knocked the air from her lungs. The Mediterranean, so idyllic and inviting from the deck of the yacht, was a churning black monster from within. Her simple cotton dress, so light and breezy moments before, became a leaden shroud tangling around her legs, pulling her down. Panic primal and absolute seized her. She thrashed her arms and legs, flailing uselessly against the crushing weight of the sea. Salt water burned her eyes and flooded her throat, choking the screams she tried to voice. Above her, the lights of the Serenity were a cruel, shrinking constellation. She could see their silhouettes against the deck lights. 2 figures standing still, watching. Not helping. Not calling for help. Just watching. The realization was colder than the water. This was not an accident. This was an execution. Her mind, in a flash of horrified clarity, pieced it all together. The late-night meetings, the jasmine perfume, the life insurance policy Daniel had insisted she sign just 6 months ago. A policy worth $50 million. He'd called it a formality, a way to protect her. She had been a liability. He was liquidating a stepping stone he was now kicking away. The love, the tenderness, the entire fairy tale. It was all a meticulously crafted lie, a long con with a deadly payout. Despair was a seductive anchor. It whispered to her, telling her to stop fighting, to let the darkness take her, to end the pain of the betrayal. Her limbs grew heavy. Her frantic movements slowed. The lights of the yacht vanished as the engines roared to life, carrying her murderer and his accomplice away into the night. She was alone in the vast, indifferent sea. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she gave in. But then something else sparked within her. Not hope, it was too early for that. It was rage, a white-hot, furious inferno that burned through the cold and the despair. Rage at Daniel's casual cruelty. Rage at Victoria's smug smile. Rage at her own blindness, her own naive trust. This, for in her belly, demanded one thing to live. Fueled by this newfound fury, she kicked off her heavy sandals and fought her way out of the tangled dress, leaving her in her simple undergarments. Treading water, she took stock. The yacht was gone. There was no land in sight, just the endless, rolling blackness of the waves under a sliver of moon. She had no idea which way to swim, no idea how far she was from shore. But she picked a direction and began to swim, her strokes clumsy but determined, fueled by a litany of hate that pounded in her head with every beat of her heart. Live, live, live. Hours bled into one another. Her muscles screamed, her body temperature plummeted, and exhaustion began to dull the edges of her rage. Delirium began to set in her mind, replaying Daniel's last words. "It's just business." The phrase echoed, mocking her. The world began to fade to a grey haze, just as her last ounce of strength gave out as her body finally went limp. Her hand brushed against something rough and abrasive. A rope. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, she clung to it. Her fingers numb and stiff barely worked, but she held on. It was a buoy line, thick with barnacles and algae. She had no strength to climb it, but she could hold on. And so she did, drifting in and out of consciousness, her body a dead weight in the cold water, her survival hanging by the thread of her own stubborn grip. She was found at dawn. Mateo Vargas, a 70-year-old fisherman from the small, forgotten village of Agios Pavlos, was checking his lines when he saw her. At first he thought she was debris, a pale scrap caught in his nets. Then he saw the slow rise and fall of her chest. He hauled her into his small, weathered boat, the El Pidadosi. Da Hope. She was blue, barely breathing her skin, a patchwork of cuts and bruises from the boy. He wrapped her in rough blankets, his gnarled hands surprisingly gentle, and motored back to his simple stone cottage overlooking the sea. For 3 days, Catherine drifted in a fever dream. Mateo, a widower with no children, nursed her with the quiet competence of a man who had spent his life at the mercy of the elements. He spoon-fed her warm broth, cleaned her wounds with local herbs, and sat by her bedside, speaking to her in a soft, guttural Greek she didn't understand, but found comforting. When she finally woke, coherent and aware, the first thing she felt wasn't relief, but terror. She was a ghost now, a woman who was supposed to be at the bottom of the sea. Daniel and Victoria thought she was dead. Let them. The idea took root in her shattered mind with crystalline certainty. Catherine Walsh, the trusting librarian, the loving wife, was dead. She had died in that water. The person who had washed ashore was someone else, someone forged in betrayal and tempered by a desire for a justice that no court could ever provide. She looked at the old fisherman, his face a road map of sun and sea, and when he asked for her name, a new one fell from her lips. Seraphina. She whispered the name of a fiery, avenging angel. In that moment, Catherine Walsh was truly gone, and Seraphina Dubois, the architect of a future reckoning, was born. The small fishing village of Agios Pavlos became both a sanctuary and a forge. It was a place outside of time where the rhythm of life was dictated by the tides and the sun. For the first few months, Seraphina was a wraith haunting the small stone cottage. She barely spoke, consumed by nightmares of cold water and a smiling, murderous husband. Matteo gave her space, his presence, a silent, steady anchor. He would leave bowls of fresh fish stew and crusty bread by her door, never pushing, never prying. He had seen the look in her eyes, before the look of someone who had survived something the sea should have claimed. Slowly the fire of her rage began to thaw the ice of her trauma. She started to help Matteo first with simple tasks like mending nets, her fingers clumsy at first, then growing deft and sure. The repetitive, tangible work was a balm to her fractured mind. She learned the sea not as a victim, but as a partner. Matteo taught her how to read the currents, to predict the weather by the color of the sky, to navigate by the stars. She grew strong, her body lean and hard from hauling nets and rowing the small boat. The soft, pampered hands of Catherine Walsh became calloused and capable. She learned Greek, absorbing the language with the same ferocious intensity she now applied to everything. Language was power, a way to build a new identity. She learned about Matteo's life, his wife lost to illness years ago, his quiet contentment with a life of simplicity. He became the father she never knew she needed, a man whose quiet integrity stood in stark contrast to Daniel's hollow, glittering charm. One day, nearly a year after her death, Matteo brought back an old newspaper from a trip to a larger town. It was used to wrap fish, but a headline caught her eye. It was in English, a business journal someone had left at a cafe. The headline read, "Petrov Innovations Soars After Tragic Loss of Founder's Wife." Her hands trembled as she smoothed out the wrinkled paper. The article was a masterpiece of public relations. It painted Daniel Petrov as a tragic, grieving widower, throwing himself into his work to cope with the unfathomable loss of his beloved wife, Catherine, who was lost at sea in a terrible boating accident. It detailed how in his grief he had brilliantly merged his company with Sharp, consolidated the firm run by the extraordinarily capable Victoria Sharp. The merger had created a new entity, Apex Global, and its stock had skyrocketed. Victoria was quoted extensively praising Daniel's resilience and vision in the face of personal tragedy. Reading the sanitized, corporate-approved lies was like being pushed into the water all over again. But this time, she didn't flail. A cold, diamond-hard resolve settled in her soul. They hadn't just tried to kill her. They had erased her, rewriting her memory to serve as the foundation for their new empire. They had monetized her death. That was the day the ghost began to plot her haunting. With Matteo's help, she used the small amount of cash she'd had in her pocket to buy an old used laptop from a traveling merchant. The village had spotty internet, but it was enough. For the next 2 years, Agios Pavlos became her university and her war room. Catherine the librarian had been a voracious reader. Seraphina the survivor became a voracious learner. She devoured everything she could find on finance, corporate law, and market manipulation. She learned about short-selling dark pools, algorithmic trading, and forensic accounting. She studied the structure of Apex Global, memorizing their board members, their assets, their vulnerabilities. She learned to code building simple programs to analyze stock patterns. She used untraceable cryptocurrency to hire tutors, online experts in niche fields of finance, who for a price would teach a mysterious Greek student named Sarah the intricacies of economic warfare. She also began to build a new identity. Using a proxy server and a labyrinth of digital smoke and mirrors, she began to construct the legend of Seraphina Dubois. She fabricated a backstory, the reclusive orphaned heiress to a French-Canadian mining fortune, educated in Switzerland, now looking to make her own mark on the world. She created social media profiles, backdated and sparingly used, showing a life of quiet intellectual luxury. A photo of a rare book in a Geneva library, a view from a Monaco apartment, a picture she bought from a stock photo site, a philosophical quote in French. She also needed capital. This was her biggest hurdle. Her break came from an unexpected source. Matteo, seeing the fire in her eyes, finally shared his own secret. His wife had come from a family that had owned a small, overlooked piece of coastal land for generations. An Athens-based luxury resort developer had been trying to buy it for years, but his wife had always refused. Matteo, with no heirs, and seeing Seraphina's burning need, decided to sell. The land, now prime real estate, sold for a staggering €3 million. He gave it all to her. "Elpida," he said, tapping the name on his boat. "Hope, your life was saved for a reason. This is not my money. It is the fuel for your purpose." Seraphina wept the first tears she had shed, not of grief or rage, but of profound gratitude. With this seed money, her plan could become a reality. She spent the next 6 months investing it masterfully in volatile but predictable commodity markets, using the knowledge she had painstakingly acquired. She was disciplined, ruthless, and brilliant. She turned 3 million into 10, then 20, then 50. 3 years to the day after Daniel had pushed her into the sea. Seraphina Dubois was no longer a fabricated identity. She was a real entity, with a real, substantial, and completely legitimate fortune. She was fluent in Greek and French, her body was strong, and her mind was a weapon. She booked a one-way first-class ticket from Athens to New York City, the headquarters of Apex Global. The ghost was coming home. New York City was a jarring symphony of noise and ambition after the tranquil shores of Agios Pavlos. It was Daniel's kingdom, a concrete and glass jungle where he reigned as one of its most celebrated predators. But Seraphina felt no fear, only a cold, thrilling sense of purpose. She was no longer the prey. She was the hunter, and this was her hunting ground. She didn't move into a flashy penthouse. Instead, she took a discreet, elegant brownstone in the West Village under her new name. She spent the first month observing, reacclimating herself to the world she had left behind. She attended art auctions, charity galas, and investment seminars, the feeding grounds of the city's elite. She moved through these spaces with an enigmatic grace, her French accent adding to her allure, her knowledge of finance and geopolitics, surprising those who initially saw only her striking beauty. She was building her legend rumor by rumor, introduction by introduction. But she knew she couldn't dismantle an empire alone. She needed an insider, a weapon with specialized knowledge, and ideally, a personal grudge. Her research had led her to one name Finian O'Connell. Finn O'Connell had once been a rising star at Petrov Innovations, a brilliant financial analyst with an almost supernatural ability to spot market trends. According to the business journals, he had been fired for gross misconduct and insider trading 2 years ago, just before the big merger. He had been publicly disgraced, his career obliterated. Daniel and Victoria had made an example of him. Seraphina dug deeper using her hacking skills to access sealed legal documents and old company emails. The truth was far darker. Finn had discovered evidence that Daniel was using a shell corporation to illegally suppress the stock of a rival company he planned to acquire. He had brought his findings to Daniel naively believing his boss would do the right thing. Instead, Daniel and Victoria had framed him, planting false evidence on his computer and using him as a scapegoat. They hadn't just fired him. They had salted the earth of his entire professional life. She found Finn O'Connell not in a sleek office, but in a dusty, cluttered apartment above a loud Irish pub in Queens, working as a freelance financial consultant for small-time clients. He was brilliant, bitter, and drowning in whiskey and cynicism. Seraphina arranged a meeting at a quiet old-world hotel bar in Midtown. When he arrived, he looked disheveled, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He expected a sales pitch. "Mr. O'Connell," she began, her voice calm and measured. "My name is Seraphina Dubois. I know what Daniel Petrov and Victoria Sharp did to you." Finn scoffed. "Get in line. What do you want an interview for a tell-all book?" "It's old news." "No," she said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm not here to write about the past. I'm here to offer you a front-row seat to the future. A future in which Apex Global is nothing but a smoking crater in the ground." He stared at her, intrigued despite himself. "You're going to take on Daniel Petrov. Lady, he's not a man. He's a fortress. You have no idea what you're up against." "On February 17th, 2022, Seraphina said softly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "you found an encrypted transaction ledger in a subfolder of the Q3 acquisitions file. The ledger detailed payments to an offshore entity called Nautilus Holdings. You traced it to a bank in the Cayman Islands, and you realized it was the shell corp Petrov was using to short a competitor's stock before a hostile takeover. You took this information to him on the 18th. By the 20th, the SEC received an anonymous tip about you, and the files were found on your personal drive. You were fired on the 21st. The color drained from Finn's face. The details were so specific, so accurate, that no journalist could have known them. This wasn't public record. This was the anatomy of his own ruin. "Who are you?" He breathed, the cynicism in his eyes replaced by a dawning, fearful respect. "I'm the person who has the means, the motive, and the capital to see this through," she replied. "I want to hire you, Mr. O'Connell. I'm not offering you a job. I'm offering you revenge, on a scale you can't even imagine." She slid a tablet across the table. On it was an account summary. The available balance was over $50 million. Finn stared at the number, then back at the enigmatic woman sitting opposite him. He saw the same fire in her eyes that had once burned in his own, before it was extinguished by betrayal. "What's in it for you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "They took something from me," Seraphina said, her gaze as cold and deep as the sea. "I'm just here to collect." That night, a partnership was forged in the crucible of shared vengeance. They worked out of Seraphina's brownstone, the walls of the study soon covered in charts, company structures and timelines. Finn, with his intimate knowledge of Petrov's strategies and weaknesses, was the master tactician. Seraphina was the grand strategist, the public face, and the unwavering will driving the entire operation. Their plan was a symphony of destruction in 3 movements. First infiltration, Seraphina would get close to Daniel, becoming an object of fascination and desire, while simultaneously sowing discord between him and Victoria. Second destabilization, they would use Finn's analytical genius and her capital to launch a series of surgical, devastating financial attacks on Apex Global, targeting its most vulnerable holdings. Third annihilation. They would orchestrate a final catastrophic event that would not only bankrupt the company, but expose Daniel and Victoria for their myriad crimes, ensuring they ended up in a prison cell, not just a bankruptcy court. The architect and the tactician were ready. The first phase was about to begin. It was time for Seraphina Dubois to formally introduce herself to Daniel Petrov. The stage for Seraphina's grand entrance was the annual Metropolitan Arts Foundation Gala, the glittering centerpiece of New York's philanthropic scene. It was a place where fortunes were flaunted and deals were sealed over champagne and canapes. It was Daniel and Victoria's natural habitat. Seraphina secured a ticket through a sizable anonymous donation, ensuring her name would be on the lips of the city's elite before she even arrived. She made her entrance not with a loud splash, but with a quiet, magnetic pull. She wore a simple yet stunningly elegant gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered under the chandeliers. Her only jewelry was a pair of antique diamond earrings. Amidst the cacophony of sequins and bravado, her understated elegance was a statement of supreme confidence. She didn't seek out the center of the room. She let the center of the room come to her. And it did. People were drawn to the mysterious Ms. Dubois, the French-Canadian heiress who had appeared from nowhere. She spoke intelligently about art, laughed easily, but revealed nothing personal. She was a beautiful, unsolvable puzzle. She saw them across the room. Daniel as handsome and charismatic as ever holding court. And Victoria, a panther in black Chanel, her arm possessively linked through his. The sight of them together sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins, but on the surface she remained serene. She did not approach them. She waited. The host of the evening, a portly old-money industrialist named Walter Finch, finally made the introduction. Daniel, Victoria. I must introduce you to Seraphina Dubois, our foundation's newest and most generous patron. Daniel turned, and his eyes met hers. For a fraction of a second, Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs. Would he see? Would he recognize the ghost of the wife he had murdered? But there was nothing, not a flicker of recognition. He saw only a beautiful, wealthy woman, a new target, a new conquest. Catherine Walsh was dead. He had killed her himself. Ms. Dubois, Daniel said, his smile the same devastatingly charming weapon she remembered so well. He took her hand, his touch sending a wave of revulsion through her that she expertly concealed. It is an absolute pleasure. Your reputation precedes you. All good things, I hope, Mr. Petrov, she replied, her voice a low, melodic purr. Victoria's eyes, however, were not smiling. They were cold, analytical slits, scanning Seraphina from head to toe. This was not a social greeting. It was a threat assessment. Dubois? Victoria said, her tone clipped. Are you related to the Quebec Dubois family? The lumber magnates? A distant branch, or perhaps? Seraphina answered vaguely, giving a small, enigmatic smile. My family preferred mining. less conspicuous. The subtle dig implying Victoria's knowledge was common was not lost on her. Over the next few weeks, Seraphina orchestrated a series of chance encounters. She was at the same exclusive restaurant, bidding on the same racehorse at a charity auction, and seated near them at the opera. She was never overt, always maintaining a cool, aloof distance that only served to stoke Daniel's interest. He was a man who loved a challenge, and Seraphina was the most intriguing challenge to enter his orbit in years. The true genius of her plan was not just seducing Daniel, but in turning him against Victoria. She did it with surgical precision. During a conversation at a gallery opening, while Daniel was momentarily distracted, Seraphina said to Victoria, "You and Daniel make such a formidable team. It must be a relief for him to have someone as brilliant as you essentially running the company, so he can focus on being the public face." The compliment was laced with poison, suggesting Daniel was merely a figurehead. She saw the flicker of pride and then suspicion in Victoria's eyes. To Daniel she played a different tune. "Victoria is extraordinary," she remarked to him over drinks at a hotel bar. "Her ambition is breathtaking. A woman like that, she'll have her own empire one day. I imagine she sees Apex as a mere stepping stone." She planted the seed of doubt. Was his partner loyal, or was she just waiting to usurp him? Finn, meanwhile, was her invisible dagger. He fed her information weaknesses in Apex's portfolio that she could casually mention in conversation. "I was considering investing in biotech," she told Daniel one evening. "But my analysts are warning me away from companies with heavy exposure in the Argentinian market. The political instability is a massive risk." She knew from Finn that Apex had just sunk $200 million into a new pharmaceutical lab in Buenos Aires, a deal championed by Victoria. 2 weeks later, when the Argentinian government unexpectedly nationalized several foreign assets, Apex's stock took a significant hit. To Daniel, Seraphina looked prescient, a financial oracle, and Victoria looked reckless. The tension between Daniel and Victoria began to show. Catherine had seen their dynamic up close. It was built on mutual greed, not trust. It was a partnership of piranhas, and Seraphina was dropping blood in the water. They started having quiet, tense arguments at social events. Victoria's possessiveness grew, which only made Daniel pull away, further drawn deeper into Seraphina's web. The final move of the infiltration phase was a direct challenge. Seraphina, through a holding company Finn had set up, initiated a small but aggressive takeover bid for a mid-size tech company that Apex Global was also trying to acquire. She deliberately overpaid, snatching the company from under their noses. It was a costly move, but it wasn't about the company. It was about the message. Daniel wasn't angry. He was impressed. He cornered her at a fundraising dinner a week later. "That was a bold move, Seraphina," he said, a wolfish grin on his face. "You cost me a lot of money." "It's just business, Daniel," she replied, echoing the last words he had ever spoken to her. A jolt went through him, but not of recognition, of excitement. He saw a kindred spirit, a ruthless player. He was hooked completely and utterly. Victoria, who had advised against the acquisition from the start, was now seen as timid and obstructionist. The wedge between them had been driven deep. Daniel invited Seraphina for a private weekend sail on his new yacht, an ostentatious replacement for the Serenity. "Just the two of us," he had said, "to discuss a potential merger of our interests." As she stood on the dock, looking at the gleaming vessel, she felt a tremor of traumatic memory. But it was quickly replaced by an icy calm. The sea was no longer her tomb. It was the backdrop for her victory. She was stepping back into the scene of the crime, not as the victim, but as the executioner. The weekend on the yacht was a masterclass in psychological warfare. To Daniel, it was a prelude to conquest both corporate and personal. To Seraphina, it was a reconnaissance mission into the heart of his corroded soul. She played the part of the intrigued investor, flawlessly dangling the possibility of a partnership, while subtly extracting critical information about Apex Global's internal vulnerabilities. He bragged, he postured, and in his arrogance, he laid bare the cracks in his empire's foundation. She returned to New York and debriefed with Finn. "He's over-leveraged," she told him, her voice cold with certainty. "He used the company's pension fund as collateral for the Buenos Aires expansion. It's highly illegal, but he's hidden it behind a wall of offshore accounts. Victoria knows. He said she called it his ace in the hole." Finn's eyes lit up with a grim fire. "The pension fund? Oh, Daniel, you fool. That's not a crack. That's a canyon. We can bury him with that." The financial takedown began on a Tuesday. It was silent, insidious. Using Seraphina's vast capital and a series of anonymous brokerage accounts spread across the globe, they began to short Apex Global's stock. It was a massive high-risk bet that the company's value would plummet. To ensure it did, they started to leak information. Finn, using his knowledge of the company's inner workings, crafted an anonymous, highly detailed report on the disastrous Argentinian investment. It didn't mention the pension fund that was their trump card, but it laid out with irrefutable evidence how management, subtly pointing the finger at Victoria's aggressive strategy, had misled shareholders about the risks. The report was sent from a secure email address to a handful of influential financial bloggers and a notoriously dogged reporter at the Wall Street Journal. The story broke on a Thursday morning. Apex Global's stock shuddered, dropping 15%. Daniel was furious but not panicked. He saw it as a market overreaction, an attack by a competitor. He called Seraphina, venting his frustration, unknowingly speaking to the very architect of his problems. She offered sympathetic words while subtly suggesting he needed to make a strong move to reassure investors. In times of instability, "Daniel," she advised, her voice a soothing balm, "the market rewards boldness. A major acquisition, a show of strength can silence the doubters." She was playing directly to his ego. He needed to look strong, especially now that his judgment was being questioned. Against a now frantic Victoria's advice to cut their losses and consolidate, Daniel announced that Apex Global was initiating a hostile takeover of a major rival, a move that would require leveraging a huge amount of capital. He was doubling down just as Seraphina and Finn knew he would. This was the moment they had been waiting for. As Daniel tied up the company's liquid assets in the takeover bid, Finn initiated the second phase of the attack. He used a complex algorithm to execute thousands of small, rapid-fire trades on Apex stock, a technique known as spoofing, creating the illusion of a massive sell-off. High-frequency trading bots programmed to react to market momentum picked up on the pattern and began selling their own shares automatically. The 15% drop became 30% hemorrhage. Margin calls were triggered across Wall Street. Lenders who had financed Daniel's aggressive expansion started to panic. Meanwhile, Victoria, convinced Seraphina was behind the attack, became unhinged. She hired a private investigator to dig into Seraphina's past. But the identity of Seraphina Dubois was a fortress built by 3 years of meticulous planning. The investigator found exactly what Seraphina wanted him to find. Swiss bank accounts, a deed to a property in Monaco, a paper trail leading back to a fabricated inheritance. He found nothing which only made Victoria look more paranoid and jealous to Daniel. Their arguments became explosive, their alliance fracturing under the immense pressure. The final blow was aimed not at the company, but at the man. Finn packaged the evidence of the pension fund embezzlement into a neat, undeniable file. He included Daniel's personal account numbers in the Cayman Islands transfer records, and even a secretly recorded phone call Finn had saved from his time at the company, where Daniel alluded to using unconventional collateral. He sent the package to the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) and the Department of Justice. The endgame unfolded with brutal speed. With the stock in free fall and lenders calling in their debts, Apex Global was on the verge of collapse. Then on a Monday morning, federal agents walked into the gleaming lobby of the Apex Tower with warrants for the seizure of all financial records. The news hit the wires, and the stock wasn't just falling anymore. It was an extinction-level event. Trading was halted. The company was worthless. That evening, Daniel Petrov sat alone in his vast, darkened office on the top floor. His kingdom was gone. His calls were not being answered. He was financially and socially radioactive. He poured himself a glass of whiskey. The silence of the empty office, a roaring testament to his failure. The door opened. It was Seraphina. She walked in, not with pity or triumph, but with an unnerving, otherworldly calm. "Seraphina." He breathed a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. "You came. They're lying, all of it. We can rebuild. You and I. There is no we," she said, her voice devoid of the French accent she had so carefully cultivated. It was flat, clear, and hauntingly familiar. She walked to the panoramic window that overlooked the city. 3 years ago, she said, her back to him. You stood on a deck and looked out at a view just like this. The Mediterranean. Do you remember what you said? A cold dread, slick and oily, began to creep up Daniel's spine. He stared at her, at the line of her shoulders, the way she held her head. Something was terribly, impossibly wrong. You said it's just business, she continued, turning slowly to face him. The light from the city skyline illuminated her face, and for the first time he truly saw her. He saw past the chic haircut and the expensive clothes. He saw the eyes, the same eyes that had looked at him with love, then with terror, as he pushed her into the sea. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. "Kate," he whispered the name, a ragged, strangled sound. "No, it can't be. You're dead." "You were wrong," Catherine Walsh said, a ghost in an emerald gown. "You didn't kill me. You just showed me what business is really about." The silence in Daniel Petrov's office was a living entity. It was the heavy, crushing silence of absolute failure. On the top floor of a skyscraper that bore his name, a name that was now synonymous with fraud and ruin, Daniel sat in the dark. His desk, usually a pristine expanse of polished mahogany, was a disaster zone. Overturned stacks of paper, a half-empty bottle of Macallan 25, and a heavy crystal paperweight lying near a spiderweb crack in the wood. He had hurled it at the wall hours ago, when the last of his board members had tendered their resignation via a curt text message. He was a king in a kingdom of ghosts, staring at the glittering, indifferent lights of the city that had once worshipped him. The soft click of the office door opening barely registered at first. He assumed it was security coming to escort him from the building for the last time. "Get out," he slurred, not bothering to turn around. "Whatever's left, take it. It's all worthless now." The only response was the sound of confident, deliberate footsteps on the marble floor. They were not the heavy, hesitant steps of a security guard. They were light, graceful, and utterly unnerving. He turned his head, his eyes struggling to focus in the dim light filtering in from the hallway. A silhouette of a woman stood in the doorway, her form framed by the light. "Seraphina!" He breathed, a surge of desperate, irrational hope cutting through the alcoholic fog. "You came. They're lying, all of it. A market attack, a corporate raid. It's a lie. We can fight this. With your capital, my vision. We can rebuild, you and I." He stumbled to his feet, a pathetic plea forming on his lips. She stepped fully into the room, and the door swung shut behind her, plunging them back into the gloom of the office, illuminated only by the city itself. She was not looking at him with pity or even anger. Her expression was one of profound, chilling serenity. "There is no we, Daniel," she said. The voice sent a tremor of unease through him. The faint, melodic French accent she had cultivated was gone. In its place was a voice from a past he had murdered, a voice he only ever heard now in the darkest corners of his nightmares. It was flat clear and North American. It was the voice of his wife. He shook his head, a grim laugh escaping his lips. "I'm losing my mind. You're even starting to sound like her." She paid his comment no mind, walking past him towards the massive panoramic window that overlooked the city. She stood there for a long moment, a queen surveying a conquered territory. 3 years ago, she began her back still to him. "You stood on the deck of a yacht and looked out at a view much like this one. The sun was setting over the Mediterranean. Do you remember what you said to her just before you pushed her?" A cold dread, slick and oily, began to crawl up Daniel's chispan. Every nerve ending screamed at him. He stared at the woman's silhouette, the elegant line of her shoulders, the way she held her head. A memory brutal and suppressed tore its way to the surface of his consciousness. "You said, 'It's breathtaking,'" she continued, her voice a low, steady cadence. "And then you leaned in and whispered, 'I'm sorry, Kate. It's just business.'" She turned slowly, deliberately. The ambient light of the cityscape caught the planes of her face, and for the first time he saw her. He saw past the immaculate hair, the couture suit, the mask of Seraphina Dubois. He saw the structure of her bones, the curve of her mouth, and most of all, her eyes. They were the same eyes that had once looked at him with such adoration. The same eyes that had widened in horrified betrayal as the sea rushed up to meet her. The whiskey glass slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. "Kate." The name was a ragged, strangled sound, a ghost's name on a dead man's lips. No, it can't be. You're dead. I watched you." "Your mistake was watching, not confirming." Catherine Walsh said the name Seraphina, now shed like a skin. "You saw what you wanted to see. You saw $50 million and a clear path to Victoria. You didn't see the woman who learned to swim on a murky lake every summer as a child. You didn't see the boy line she clung to for 6 hours, the splinters digging into her hands. You didn't see the old fisherman who pulled her from the water, his hands kinder than yours had ever been. You were so busy building an empire on my memory, you never thought to check if the grave was empty." He backed away, his legs hitting the edge of his desk. He looked utterly broken, his mind a battlefield of denial and horrifying acceptance. "Victoria," he rasped, his mind latching onto the only other person in his sinking lifeboat. Did she know? Was she part of this? Catherine gave a short, sharp laugh, devoid of all humor. "Victoria has been quite busy. She became convinced you were losing your edge, sleeping with the competition, me and making reckless decisions, she decided it was time to cash out. She pulled a slim tablet from her handbag and tapped the screen. She turned it to face him. It was a live security feed from a private terminal at JFK Airport. It showed Victoria Sharp, her face a mask of fury and disbelief, being led away in handcuffs by 2 Port Authority officers. Your brilliant partner was attempting to board a private jet to Belize, a flight I had my associate book for her, Catherine explained coolly. Her luggage contained $2 million in cash and bearer bonds, and a hard drive containing enough evidence to grant her immunity in exchange for her testimony against you. Unfortunately for her, my associate also tipped off the authorities. A piranha will always eat the other piranha when the food runs out. She was going to leave you to rot, Daniel. I just made sure she couldn't. The final betrayal seemed to dissolve the last of his strength. He slumped into his chair, a king on a ruined throne surrounded by the shards of his life. Tears of self-pity streamed down his face. Why? He pleaded, his voice the whine of a petulant child. Why do all this? The company? The money? You could have just gone to the police. The police! She walked towards him, her heels clicking like the countdown of a clock. And watch you weave a web of lies with your army of lawyers. Watch them paint me as a scorned, hysterical woman. Watch you get a reduced sentence on a technicality, no. She stopped in front of his desk, looking down on him. That's not justice. Justice isn't about retribution. It's about education. I needed to teach you. She leaned forward, placing her hands on his desk. I wanted you to feel the absolute, terrifying freefall. I wanted you to feel the cold, lonely darkness as your entire world is swept away by a force you can't see or understand. Justice isn't a prison cell, Daniel. A man like you would find a way to thrive in prison. Justice is this moment. The silence when your phone has stopped ringing. The look in the eyes of people who used to admire you. The rest of your miserable life knowing that you were outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and utterly destroyed by the quiet librarian you threw away. Like she was nothing. She reached into her pocket and placed a small, simple object on the polished wood, a weathered grey stone smoothed by the relentless sea. The old man who saved me, Matteo, gave me this. He said it was to remind me that even the hardest things can be worn down by patience and persistence. You thought you were an ocean, Daniel, vast, powerful, and in control. But you're just a stone, and the tide you created has finally completely worn you away. She straightened up her lesson delivered. She turned and walked towards the door, her part in his life concluded. Wait! He cried out, a desperate, broken sound. Kate, please, what happens to you now? She paused at the doorway, framed once again by the light, a figure of judgment. She looked back at him one last time, her expression unreadable. Seraphina Dubois will be liquidating her assets and channeling them into a new philanthropic foundation, she said, her voice calm and final. It will fund libraries in underserved communities and create a relief fund for fishermen in small coastal villages around the world. As for Catherine, you killed her 3 years ago. Remember, you can tell her story to the other inmates. They'll have plenty of time. She walked out without another word, the click of the door sealing his fate. She didn't hear his anguished scream. She didn't need to. All she heard were the sirens growing closer and closer, a triumphant symphony announcing the end of his reign and the beginning of her peace. She walked into the cool New York night, no longer a ghost haunted by the past, but a woman finally in command of her future. In the end, this wasn't just a story of revenge. It was a story of rebirth. Catherine Walsh had to die so that a woman strong enough to demand justice could live. She stripped away her husband's fortune, dismantled his empire, and exposed his darkness to the world. Not with a weapon, but with a will of iron and a mind sharpened by betrayal. It's a chilling reminder that the deepest wounds often inspire the most profound transformations, and that true power isn't about the money you have, but the resilience you discover when everything is taken from you. Daniel Petrov thought he was closing a chapter by pushing his wife into the sea. But he was wrong. He was just starting a story, her story. And it was a story that would end with his complete and utter destruction. What did you think of Catherine's journey? Was her revenge justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories of incredible survival and ultimate justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to light.